Ave Maris Stella.
Hello and welcome back to Vatican II in a Year. This is your host, Father Matthew Schneider, a priest of the Legionaries of Christ and a theology professor. This is a podcast on the StarQuest Production Network at sqpn.com. Today we are on day 238 and we're covering Dignitatis Humanae 13 on freedom of the church to operate. If you want to follow along, we have a reading plan and more details at sqpn.com/Vatican and frmatthewlc.com/Vatican. Yesterday we spoke about the doctrine of no coercion to the faith and thus religious liberty has always been in the church in seed form, even though this is the first a formal declaration by the magisterium. Today, we're going to talk about how the church needs her freedom to operate in society for the salvation of souls. And paragraph 13, which we're covering today, has 4 subparagraphs. We're going to read them in 3 groups. So the summary of A is that the church should have freedom as the salvation of souls requires. B and C talks about how the church needs freedom from government for operation and law, and it needs that freedom legislated in law, that sense. And then D links freedom of the church with religious freedom, linking this part with the other parts of the same document. So let's read 13a. Among the things that concern the good of the church, indeed the welfare of society here on earth, things therefore that are always and everywhere to be kept secure and defended against all injury, this certainly is preeminent, namely that the church should enjoy the full measure of freedom which her care for the salvation of men requires. This is a sacred freedom because the only begotten Son endowed with it, the church he purchased with his blood. Indeed, it is so much the property of the church that to act against it is to act against the will of God. The freedom of the church is the fundamental principle in what concerns the relations between the church and governments and the whole civil order. So there we have it. One side note here, that the Vatican documents here, when they use men, they mean it as in human person, not as in male human being. English is more distinct in that. Many other languages use male as the common, like in Spanish, you have nosotros if there's at least one in the group. For us, if there's at least one, but nosotras if it's just a group of females, right? And the same thing for other things in Spanish or French or other things like that. So the church needs freedom to be able to help save people's souls. She is the vessel of salvation. Thus, she needs protection at all times and places. This is the fundamental principle for church-state relations, this idea that the church needs this freedom in order to save souls, because the church needs freedom from government coercion. Just as we've mentioned that the government can't coerce people to be any particular religion, they can't coerce the church either, because the church needs that freedom, and that freedom is very important because it will work for the salvation of souls in this reality. That's an important aspect, right? And this is sacred freedom, right? Because it comes from Jesus' salvific acts. Jesus granted us his freedom as the sons of God, granted the church freedom to operate in this world, and that is salvific. And then the church must always respect it as God's will. This is something that's important. This is important, and it pertains to the whole civil order. So the whole idea of church-state relations need to begin with this idea. So moving on to 13b and c, the church needs freedom from government for operation, and this needs to be set down in the law. B, in human society and in the face of government, the church claims freedom for herself in the character as a spiritual authority established by Christ the Lord, upon which there rests by divine mandate the duty of going out into the world and preaching the gospel to every creature. The church also claims freedom for herself in the character as a society of men who have the right to live in society in accordance with the precepts of the Christian faith. C, in turn, where the principle of religious freedom is not only proclaimed in words or simply incorporated in law, but also given sincere and practical application, there the church succeeds in achieving a stable situation of right as well as of fact, and the independence which is necessary for the fulfillment of her divine mission. So this is important in the fact, right, that the church needs freedom from the state. We don't want these altar and crown alliances where the crown tends to push the altar and try to control the altar, right? That's the kind of historical thing where you'd have the union between the church and the state, and the state would eventually usually get control over the church in some way. You can see it in a lot of the state churches in Europe. You can see it if you read the history of Byzantium as well, although it's the church did fight back and wasn't always completely taken over by the state, but they did have the state had undue power over it. And the same thing, the state shouldn't be able to pick bishops. And the churches, historically, the church gave states a lot of power to pick bishops, a lot of power to veto or to present a series of candidates or things like that. Whereas now, the church is not doing that. And the church is generally insisting that she has her own freedom without interference from the state. Not perfectly, because not every state will agree to that. But most states, for example, I've lived my whole life in Canada and the U.S., and it would be ridiculous to think that the government of Canada and the U.S. would think they could tell the church who should be the next bishop. Maybe they'd throw out some names, but I don't think they'd have any power over it. And it would seem very foreign to us. But that was the practice for much of Christian history. And so as a society, the church needs freedom. It needs freedom to operate. So that we, like we were talking about a few days ago, we train our clergy, we decide on things. We organize ourselves into groups for social, for religious activities, for charitable activities. And this is not just that the state says nice things. The state says, oh, you're free, it's all good for you. No, we need the state to put in laws, put in rights, put in fact. And it's important to have both the laws and the activity as it happens. Because the laws present kind of a rules on the book, but then also, at times, there can be the law, but there can be what everybody knows the law. And this can be fine at certain times. For example, on freeways in the U.S., it's generally accepted that the actual speed limit, where you actually might get a ticket, is 10 above the speed limit that's posted. And everybody pretty much accepts that, and we all drive. At least I generally drive about 5, 7 over the speed limit. If there's no traffic, obviously, I'm not going to cause an accident. Whereas it can be very problematic in other places where technically white-collar crime's illegal, but if you're a friend of the president or whatever else, you can get away with all this white-collar crime. That's a problem for a lot of these corrupt regimes in other parts of the world where the brothers, the friends, etc. of the president can do all this white-collar crime, and it just makes the whole system completely inefficient, completely just a kleptocracy or a rule by theft, right? And in the same way, we need both the law, what's on the books, and the actual practice that if somebody kills somebody else for converting or somebody tries to interfere in the church's action, that the state will actually respond and properly protect the church's freedom to operate. Just like the church should protect the freedom of the Sikhs to have their thing, of the Jews to have their thing, and things like that. So finally, we have paragraph 13D, which links the freedom of the church and religious freedom. Let's read it. D. This independence is precisely what the authorities of the church claim in society. At the same time, the Christian faithful, in common with all other men, possess the civil right not to be hindered in leading their lives in accordance with their consciences. Therefore, harmony exists between the freedom of the church and the religious freedom, which is to be recognized as the right of all men and communities and sanctioned by constitutional law. So the church claims its authority. She claims its authority for herself to operate. But she also asks it for other religions. We claim to have the freedom to operate, but we also support that the Jews in the synagogue down the street have the right to operate their synagogue as they see fit. And everyone has the right to live according to their conscience, as long as that conscience doesn't cause issues in civil order. If their conscience is causing them to steal, well, that's an issue. If their conscience is commanding human sacrifice, that's an issue. But if their conscience is saying that they should get up at 4 a.m. and pray and offer 5 sticks of incense to the statue of their god or something like that, okay, that's perfectly fine. We shouldn't interfere with that. And so this idea in this subparagraph is pointing out how the general theme of this whole document about religious liberty also links back to this about the church being free to operate, because that is the church it's the same thing looking at it from 2 different perspectives, and they're really linked and united. That concludes today. Thank you for listening to this episode of Vatican II in a Year. This is a listener-supported podcast. You can donate to help StarQuest produce it and other great podcasts at sqpn.com/give. You can give one-time monthly join the StarQuest Patreon. Tomorrow we're going to continue with the next paragraph in Dignitatis Humanae, which is paragraph 14 on sharing the gospel with all. Please join us then to learn more about Vatican II, which will provide a blueprint for the Catholic Church. Go to sqpn.com/Vatican, frmatthewlc.com/Vatican, or Vatican SQPN on Facebook and X for more information on the podcast, such as playlists for individual documents and a reading plan. There is also an SQPN Discord server at sqpn.com/Discord, and on there is a channel for Vatican II in a year.
Amen.